Welcome. I greet all our viewers to today's BirchTalk. BirchTalk is the discussion on sustainability topics from Birch. Our topic today is Scope 3 in Focus, Procurement as a driver of sustainability. Sustainability is an extremely important topic of our time. Accordingly, it must no longer play a secondary role in the procurement process of companies. By deliberately selecting sustainable suppliers, companies can significantly reduce their carbon footprint and make a substantial contribution to climate protection. In this BirchTalk, we want to explore the question of how to transform manual processes into data-driven processes in procurement, especially with how to integrate sustainable data and sustainability data so that purchasing decisions are made not only efficiently and based on economic considerations, but also increasingly based on sustainability data and sustainability criteria in the future. And we have two wonderful guests today. First, there is Andreas Zimmermann, whom we are very pleased to have. He is the founder and CEO of the company Supplier, a service provider that helps companies optimize their procurement processes. And then we have Stefan Noller, the CEO of UBirds. And I now welcome both of them here in the circle. Hello, Stefan. Hello, Andreas.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Hello, hello. Yes. Before we get started, I would like to briefly introduce you to the audience. Andreas, at BirchTalk, we aim to speak with insiders and experts, and naturally, we are especially pleased when we succeed in securing a true heavyweight, a top expert, and I believe we have found such a person today in Andreas Zimmermann. Andreas originally studied business informatics in Hamburg and founded the ChangePoint consulting firm there 16 years ago, which has since become a whole company focused on the topic of purchasing and procurement, or as it is probably called today, procurement. Andreas, why don't you tell us a bit about your career path and how you originally got into the topic of purchasing? What fascinates you about it?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, not too many compliments or I'll turn completely red here. So, at the end of the day, as the saying goes, you don't choose purchasing. Rather, you somehow end up in purchasing. And so it has been somewhat the same for me. I have primarily built my consulting business in the areas of change processes, corporate culture, and then also in the technical fields. But I was also often on the other side of the table and frequently negotiated with purchasing. And I kept asking myself, why do they actually do it that way? And there you can still find a cool solution, especially to avoid playing the classic role of saying, I will now get 3 offers. Then, the specialist chooses one, and purchasing is allowed to negotiate down by 3%. That can't really be the role of purchasing, as I've experienced it very, very often. And then we started with that and built something that truly allows one to leverage the entire competition in purchasing and simply brings in good methods, established concepts like game theory, for example. And that was somewhat the idea of Supplier, to also assist purchasing in making a good procurement very easily. And so, in principle, this transformation has also occurred somewhat from consulting towards more into the product. Supplier.
Okay, now you have already mentioned Supplier directly. That is the company you founded, where you are currently the CEO. Would you like to briefly introduce the company and its USP to our listeners? What do you do at its core?
Sure. So, in principle, it is often the case that companies, especially dealing with a lot of spending, which is often very, very detailed, there is not only the highly strategic spending, where it is totally fine for a strategic procurement to invest several days in such a procurement process, but the company actually consists of many small procurement processes that simply require a lot of effort. And what is often the case is that there is simply a lack of personnel to cover this properly, to be able to carry out all these purchasing processes sensibly, to conduct a good tender, and to make good negotiations. What we have done is develop software that can highly automate this entire process in order to create a digital procurement for small spending. Exactly that is what we have done. And for us, simplicity and automation are the main focus, where in the end we help a requester, when they need something, to easily enable them to purchase these things. And this is not only about catalogs and contracts, but especially regarding the procurement of smaller items, like a small tender that I create for any products or services I need, including negotiations, so that suppliers can essentially handle the procurement for such smaller, can significantly relieve needs and still highly, yes, I would say, adhere to high policies to avoid causing maverick buying. That is the core of supplier.
Okay, thank you. I think that was quite illustrative and very concise. So we understood that it is less about the large strategic purchases where one takes the time, but rather the many small spends, as you said, which I believe is a technical term from procurement. The spend, I initially first thought about exactly what you mean. The small spends, meaning the small purchases, which essentially create a lot of work, where one must also adhere to rules, because small things can add up in the end, but this can be well automated. And there is your core idea, obviously. Exactly. It came across very well. Thank you very much. I would like to introduce the distinguished second speaker, as is customary. At the BirchTalk by UBirch, this is a representative of our host UBirch. And with us today is Stefan Noller, the founder and CEO of UBirch. At UBirch, everything revolves around the publication and exchange of emission data with the ESG Data Exchange Network. Do you like that? In short sentences, Stefan, please introduce what UBirch does and, of course, what benefit the ESG Data Exchange Network has in this context.
Yes, of course, gladly. So we are also driven to provide technology that helps mitigate climate change. And one quickly encounters these scope 3 evidences. Many companies have 80-90% of all medicine, which is scope 3.
You are a bit hard to understand, Stefan. I think the microphone is far away. Yes, it's back again.
Yes. Is it better now? Yes. Yes. I'm sorry. Exactly. So we specialize in scope 3 indirect emissions. And they account for 80-90% of total emissions in many companies. That's why it's worth doing something about it from a climate protection perspective. The problem is that you then talk about very many detailed emission reports that come from third parties because I have to obtain them from my suppliers. And you can either choose the messy way, for example, by asking all suppliers via email or calling or sending faxes or something like that. Everything is conceivable in Germany. Or you can use a technology. And we thought we want to provide a smart technology, a platform with which you can collect them, establish and maintain contact with the suppliers, and of course aggregate them to compile your footprint from the indirect emissions. That's UBird.
Great, that was quick and to the point. You mentioned scope 3 a few times. It's also in our title today. Maybe for everyone who doesn't know it that well, would you like to say a sentence about it? What does scope 3 mean and how is it related?
Exactly, gladly. So scope 3 is a category in the greenhouse gas protocol which was developed to capture CO2 and CO2-like emissions. It has been around for 20 years. The greenhouse gas protocol is used worldwide in many standards. It is actually the global standard for capturing CO2 emissions. And the EU has used this greenhouse gas protocol in its CSRD legislation, which became active this year and will obligate many more companies starting next year, which is very encouraging. And in the greenhouse gas protocol, there are scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 refers to the direct emissions that one causes oneself, such as heating in the basement, cars, and so on. Scope 2 is everything related to the energy one purchases. And scope 3 includes all indirect emissions. And that is a category that causes many headaches because these are simply not things that one can figure out in their own basement with their own people. But one has to go to someone else who is a supplier. And it becomes clear why this talk is so exciting because the entire supply chain, suppliers, procurement, and so on, is a whole business that needs to be tackled. if one wants to leverage a significant impact for sustainability.
Okay. Yes, you have already hinted at why we are having this conversation today and why there is actually an interesting question involved. Before we continue, I would like to add a quick note. If anyone from our audience has a question for the two speakers, it's very simple. You can ask it directly now for the live discussion and enter it in the comment functions. So just use the comment functions and formulate a question. We will take care of it as soon as it fits somehow. Yes, Andreas, let's start right at the beginning. The procurement process of companies. Where are the challenges and how does it work a bit more specifically with your product?
A procurement process has various challenges. At the very beginning, it is of course about understanding what I actually need to purchase. This means, in principle, especially if I assume that we are more in indirect spending, the things that might come in more ad hoc, where someone says, I just need something.
Indirect spending, means what exactly?
The things that directly flow into the production process, but are outside the production process, and are otherwise needed in the company. So that is not what goes directly into the company's product. And these are often things because within the product, the things are relatively well planned. There I know exactly, okay, to build such a car, I need these and those things. Indirect spend is, of course, a lot of ancillary items that come along. That's a really silly example to mention. I need toilet paper, etc. These are all such things that are, of course, all in the area of indirect spend, and that changes daily. Different needs come in all the time. Many things are also plannable and can partly be represented in catalogs, but a lot is also very, very unplannable. And then, if someone, for example, is setting up new things, I'm building a new plant, I need desks for that, I need who knows what kind of things, then those are, of course, all items that simply need to be procured in some way. And in doing so, it is, of course, particularly important to describe the things well, what it is actually about. What do I really need now? And that is the first challenge I have in such a process, because if I don't know exactly what it is, then I have a high coordination effort between the person who said, I need something, and then the purchasing department. And those are the first things where, of course, AI can help a lot to relieve the purchasing department. These are the first challenges we will also deal with. Further challenges are, okay, who are the good suppliers for this product, for this procurement? That is the next topic we will also deal with and for which we have developed an AI. Then in the next step, it is about, okay, when I have made a tender, when I have obtained offers, then I have to look at them, then I have to evaluate them. Then questions also arise, such as whether the topic of sustainability is relevant. Should I incorporate it in some way into my purchasing decision, or does it not matter to me at all? That is also a matter of the company. And ultimately, what are the things that I will also do? To make the decision, how do I negotiate with these companies? There is a lot that can be done to essentially automate such things. And at the end of the day, it is a relatively long and complex process that, as they say, takes place in purchasing during such a sourcing process, which simply brings a certain complexity with it. And that leads to the fact that often a lot of capacities are tied up for small things. And that was also our approach to say that we want to counteract this by relieving procurement so that there is really more time for not only the small things, so that simple processes are carried out, but also that there is capacity in the strategic area that I need to make a really good strategic purchasing decision and to be able to engage intensively with suppliers regarding partnerships and all those things. And from that perspective, it is also a mega topic in procurement that one says AI simply has a huge lever and enormous potential to significantly improve things, especially in procurement. And of course, especially LLMs have made their way in recent years, because many use cases can be wonderfully represented with LLMs, things like demand description or supplier negotiations, and so on. These are things that have certainly been influenced by the wave we have just experienced with ChatGPT. which is now known in many places, and which has continued to evolve into many other wonderful LLMs that have emerged over time. And we are still at the very beginning, and agent systems are emerging more and more. And these are certainly potentials that I can utilize to meaningfully represent such processes, which have often, as mentioned, been quite neglected, simply with the right technology. And that then also gives me to connect back to the topic of sustainability, realistic possibilities to automate the inclusion of topics like sustainability considerations in the overall assessment, because otherwise it is simply not be able to represent resource expenditure because it is just not feasible to handle manually. And therefore AI is certainly an absolute driver here to enable such topics to be automated at all.
You have mentioned AI and LLMs quite often now. We all know them quite well by now. These are basically the language-based systems with which one can converse like with a human. Can one imagine it this way, that basically the purchasing department no longer takes care of this indirect purchasing? As you said, everything that arises on the side, which is not immediately needed in the core production process, it doesn't take care of that at all. Actually, AI takes over its role. Can one say that? I need the toilet paper in your example here. So I say, the AI needs toilet paper, and then I ask questions like how much, what quality, and when and where. Does that mean that the questions necessary to trigger the purchasing process are now asked by the AI? Can one say that?
Exactly right. And not to the purchasing department, but even to the need bearer. So the one who has the need is asked these questions.
So he gets asked those questions as the purchasing department would otherwise ask me. I call in, I need toilet paper, and then they ask me the question. Exactly, right?
Right, exactly right. But one must understand that the idea now is not to say a black box where some wild AI robot does something in the company, but quite the opposite. The purchasing department specifies exactly what it should do for them. So it is simply another purchasing department that has, let's say, infinite resources, but fulfills and implements things exactly, I would say, in the interest of purchasing, so that the purchasing department invests some time in saying how the AI should work for me. Not that there is some wild something, but quite the opposite. It takes over these topics in the interest of purchasing and does so specifically for product groups. This means that in every product group, varied regulations may prevail. Other things that are important. The purchasing department has a lot of experience with this. What should one pay attention to? And the idea is, of course, that the purchasing department can also hand this over to the topic accordingly, so that the systems work in the interest of purchasing and simply support the purchasing department. But the purchasing department, that is the important part, remains in the driver's seat. So the one in the driver's seat will essentially be the one who continues to control and shape the processes. Where do I, as a person, start to take care of things again? And what are the topics that I would like to delegate to a system in whatever form?
Yes, understood. Okay, so the purchasing department sets the rules according to which the AI essentially collects the information and makes decisions. That makes sense. Now, we need to bring sustainability into play. Stefan, help us out. You loudly state on various channels that a company's sustainability largely depends on purchasing. And why is that actually the case? Why is purchasing so important for sustainability? Isn't it the energy consumption? Isn't it the general handling of resources? What makes purchasing so important?
Yes, I believe people have no idea how much companies purchase and how large the supply chain is. People always think that these are just some large manufacturing companies that have truckloads of suppliers and so on. But we know from customers, and Andreas can certainly confirm this, that even smaller, medium-sized companies often have 1,000 suppliers or more. And that means a large part of the value creation of goods sales and so on happens through supply. That's how the economy works. And as I said, this also leads to the somewhat surprising finding that a large part of the emissions lies there as well. It makes sense then if I don't just buy emissions intensive things like cement or something, but simply because a large part of my activity is actually indirect. And that's why it's a very simple conclusion. If 80 to 90% of my emissions lie with the suppliers, then it is, of course, it makes the most sense to start making any changes there because they have the greatest leverage. And at the same time, I think Andreas described that very nicely. And now we are recording today, which is Thursday, after the election decision in the USA has been made. This cannot be elaborated on here, but there is definitely a backlash on this topic. So you can't also burden the buyer who orders his pallet truck and is already doing various things with AI support with the task of reading sustainability reports or going to websites to consider which material causes more emissions with the pallet truck or something like that. This needs to be automated if we want to make this leverage usable on a larger scale, and we need that if we want to march towards net zero. It has to work in an automatable way. It can't happen through conviction alone, but it has to happen almost automatically. And that's why the procurement management software, what Andreas is doing, is so exciting. You have to somehow integrate it into this process so that it simply becomes a normal part of the purchasing decision, that sustainability is checked as a decision criterion, and that's it.
Yes? Understood. It basically has to be a rule, like others that procurement set. Andreas, you said your AI works according to the rules set by procurement. I assume you know what kind of rules they typically set. What role does sustainability play today? That would be interesting. Is it standard for procurement to treat sustainability as an important criterion, or do we still have development potential there?
Well, there is definitely potential for development. The topic comes up in many places, is on everyone's lips, and is often located more in the strategic area. That is something that is, I would say, somewhat humanly possible, something that can also be covered, where I say, okay, for my highly strategic suppliers, I will of course obtain some EcoVadis reports and so on. And that is the level that can still be handled in a somewhat old school way, I would say, but I would say, to be fair, procurement doesn't really get a handle on the smaller spending. Anyway, that means procurement is running relatively, I would say, to put it mildly, not optimally. It is not well tendered. It is not done well. It is not clean. Accordingly, this whole process is also lived, and therefore, one must also say that it is simply somewhat technology related, because I simply cannot manage it in terms of volume. And therefore, quite simply, one must also say that one should hold back on finger pointing, because it was simply hardly possible. And I have to say that this is changing right now. We have technological possibilities that we have partly created, and others to simply create the opportunities to do such things as well, to implement it technologically. And then one basically has to ask a few questions and say, okay, how much is sustainability worth to me in my consideration of my supplier base in procurement? This can be done relatively well with a topic like Scope 3. If I have access to this data, then the question is, how much is a ton of CO2 emissions worth to me? For example, I can easily offset that and say, I simply calculate it against the price. One just needs to agree on what one wants. And then, of course, such processes can be somewhat automated if the data is available. If I do not have access to this data, then I still cannot do that. Other topics? If one might deviate for a moment from the topic of Scope 3 or CO2 emissions and say, there are other topics where I say, okay, topics like customers are certainly also showstoppers. They say, okay, that is, and for us, we would rather speak of a requirement that, for example, no customers prevail, that I do not accept that as a company at all. But other criteria, such as how high a certain score is always a relative consideration. A company is not just unsustainable and sustainable, but there is a lot of gray in between. And the question is always, how much value is it to me at the end of the day that I say this company adheres to certain sustainability guidelines, has a better score, and I can certainly factor that into the price. This means at the end of the day that a company with a better score will also be more expensive. This means the company invests classically in its own sustainability, in whatever criteria it may cover, in order to be able to say, okay, we now have a better score, and at the end of the day, I invest in that, then I can also charge my customers more for it. And at the end of the day, it is a decision of the companies that they simply have to make. And we ask, what is that worth to me? I can't just say that I want sustainability everywhere for everything, but I treat suppliers who are completely unsustainable and suppliers who are completely sustainable as completely equal in price. That is not acceptable. And that is something that purchasing must also decide. And that does not mean that this should fall solely on the individual buyer, but it must also go through the management to the companies and say, okay, what should we do here? But once this data is available and says, okay, this is worth it to us, this is, I don't know, this is a CO2 pricing that we always want to apply, also in the consideration, or these are things that are simply important corporate decisions in sustainability for us that we also want to implement in purchasing. Then, can I automate that? And then it becomes a no-brainer out there. But it is crucial that these decisions are made accordingly, and that it is not just said that sustainability is, in principle, completely free. That does not mean that it cannot also lead to that. Especially when looking at the issue of CO2, it does not have to be necessarily more expensive, but also the question of supplier development. If I am already pricing in things now, especially regarding the issue of CO2, that will become very expensive for me later, then the supplier decisions I make today are also a very, very important topic. And that is why I should also consider such things with a future-oriented perspective and in light of all the upcoming legislative proposals that will also affect many companies, so that they are not left out. Therefore, I believe it is simply a very, very important topic that one does not just leave this thing lying around for the next few years until the big bang comes.
I would like to briefly interject here, Matthias, if I may, because I believe a dangerous impression could arise here, namely that it is somewhat a question of whether companies can freely choose to be interested in being sustainable or not, because that is not the case. Not only because we are already seeing significant consequences of climate change, but there is European legislation that has been in effect since the beginning of this year for large listed companies and will apply to all companies with 250 employees or more starting next year. They have to do it. Although they may not have to do it in the first year if they have 250 employees, they must do two things. On the one hand, they must clarify their supply chain regarding emissions, at least filtered by materiality. So, for the significant suppliers, one must know the emission data. And the other thing that is often forgotten is that a reduction target must be pursued. So it's not just about reporting, oh, look, we have this much CO2. Yes, interesting. Rather, the EU has set a goal to be net zero by 2050. And that is not so incredibly far away when one thinks about production processes, supply chains, and the like. And that means it's not just something where one can say, yes, that's interesting, let's take a look. Oh no, we don't have time for that, or something like that. Starting next year, 15,000 companies in Germany are required to do this. And at the latest, by the year after next, they must also demonstrate reduction effects of a proper magnitude, which is often not achievable with their direct emissions. One can switch the service vehicles to electric and maybe also install a heat pump in the office. That is usually no longer possible. Then one has exhausted all potential. A few people can take the train a bit who previously drove to work. It is quickly exhausted and then one has to go into the supply chain. So, it should not give the impression that this is something one can just take a look at and the particularly committed companies might do it, while others do not. It will not be like that. Everyone with more than 250 employees must do this.
It's good that you say that, Stefan. You've also been participating for a few weeks now. I think one can say, with great success, videos on LinkedIn where you explain all these connections, and it's fun, but it often provides very basic information. Therefore, my question to you is, do you feel, also due to the success of these videos, which one could dismiss as trivial, do you feel we still have a knowledge problem? Is it still not clear to many?
Totally. We have, as always, this nerd bubble problem, that there are people who immediately know what Scope 3 is and so on, and who has to do this and so forth. But Of course, 99.9% of people in business also do not know or are uncertain. This is partly due to the fact that the laws are constantly being adjusted. Even today, the Coalition Committee is meeting and will decide on the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Unfortunately, it is the case that the legislator, both nationally and at the EU level, is constantly enacting new things. The Deforestation Directive has just been postponed at the EU level and so on. I believe that is all due to the matter. Climate change requires quick action, and then you also have to change course and so on. But for companies, it has become super complex because there is not only the CSRD, but also the Deforestation Directive and the CBM Directive and so on. But there are those, you always have to check which version is currently valid. Has it been postponed? Does it have any transition period? Have any easements been agreed upon at the last minute? The answer is almost always yes. And this naturally leads to the fact that even experts often cannot precisely answer what is currently applicable. That's why we also use a lot of AI, for example. A bit different from you, Andreas. For us, it's more about consulting. The AI can relatively quickly capture which law has been published now, or which ISO standard, for example. But I can totally understand when people out there say, yeah, I didn't know that. Or in my last video, Matthias, on the topic of shopping, I simply went to the supermarket and checked whether this is basically the most mundane shopping process that one has daily. One can buy sustainable products. And indeed, there are frozen products from Froster, for example, which I may mention here. They print a CO2 label on the back of each product, which is also very well done, with a QR code, details on the website, etc. That makes a difference. Then I can say that my customers are indeed interested in this. We shop with climate awareness. And companies that don't print, that will just stay on the shelf, that makes for a simple decision.
Yes, but it is a decision. And I believe Andreas said something important. A strategic decision must also be made for purchasing. Someone has to say, how much is that worth to us? That's basically how it works. What is a ton of CO2 worth to us? How many euros exactly? And I understood that when that happens, your tool is perfect for putting it into practice, because then it will simply be factored in. And then a similarly priced product that is better in terms of emissions can simply have an advantage. Perhaps even a more expensive product because it is better in terms of emissions, but in the end, it requires someone to determine the value of sustainability. Someone has to say the ton is worth so much to us. I mean, with the CO2 pricing, which politics also has to push forward somehow, that will naturally happen on its own. But one always has the feeling that everything is moving too slowly for our environment here. So it does require a bit of initiative and commitment from the companies. Now I wanted to bring up another aspect that we still need to talk about. You have said it a few times, Andreas. So in passing, you always said when the data is available, and that is of course an interesting question. Stefan just mentioned it. There are products in the supermarket that have data on them. How much CO2 is associated with this? But that is of course still far from being systematic and available everywhere. So in purchasing, one can say that everything has a price. Let's assume that, but whether every item also has CO2 data, we do not know yet. Or how is it actually, what is the data situation, Andreas?
Yes, it is of course manageable. Many companies do not have this data to be able to say, when I purchase these items from company XY, how much CO2 is associated with it, especially to compare suppliers with each other. So the data situation is still quite manageable, and you really need good data to work with it properly. That is, unfortunately, that is still not the standard.
And that is one of the things we are discussing here. Sorry, I have to press the announcement buzzer. You have to imagine that in your mind, exactly because one reason we come together here is always the question, what do we do now? We as YouBirds hosts here. And in fact, our platform is a publishing platform for ESG data. One could also say encourage already several hundred companies to publish their ESG data so that it can be easily found. And in fact, we finally activated an API for this purpose this week, where companies like suppliers can systematically query it so that someone can say, here, I'm looking for the pallet truck or the toilet paper. This manufacturer, BAM, API request to the subway system, does it have a disclosure in the system? And that is basically the freezer QR code print on the back of the package in digital form, which can then be accessed by us.
Super cool.
Because indeed, Andreas, what you said, we hear that from all corners. So data scarcity is probably one of the biggest hindrances to sustainability at the moment. So anything that can be done to somehow increase the availability of good data helps enormously at the moment, because there is not a single company that does not complain about it.
Yes, that is an important announcement. I would prefer to talk a bit more about the data, Stefan, specifically with the aspect of broadening our knowledge. There is often talk about different types of data. You like to talk about primary data. With primary data, there are also secondary data. Often there are no primary data, only secondary data. Which is better? What is the difference? Could you elaborate on that a bit? I think it fits well here.
Sure, gladly. So that can actually be explained relatively quickly, because if you imagine I had an appointment with a hospital today, they have a laundry service that supplies them. And it probably has a high energy demand and high emissions. And if this hospital now receives from this laundry, let's say they call and say, we need more accurate emissions data from your laundry process. What machines do you use? What type of electricity? Do you have direct heating? And so on and so forth. Then this will have two consequences. On the one hand, the data is simply better because the manufacturer has determined it themselves. They have looked closely at the facilities and so on, rather than if I were to estimate them with some estimation factors. And the other, perhaps even more important effect is that it will trigger a small wave in this laundry, because the hospital might be a big customer and they say, oh, they suddenly ask such questions they have never asked before. What kind of washing machine do we have? Great, 30 years old, consumes electricity endlessly, produces more wastewater than necessary, and so on. So it triggers, so to speak, without explicitly saying as a customer, please take a look. One just takes a look. And by the way, there are studies on this showing that about 8 to 10% reduction is achieved simply by asking, meaning that the topic is brought to the table in the form of a data request, for example. And those are two important reasons. First, you get better data when it is primarily, that is, truly self-collected data, and they have a greater control effect. And that way I can better pursue my reduction target when I know the actual data, because if I estimate something, then it's always just, at some point, they notice nothing of it. And it is always only as good as the industry average, because the estimate is usually an industry average value. The average laundry consumes this and that much electricity, then he gets that value. But he can't do anything about it. Maybe he is better than that. However, he has no chance to show that he is better because he is always stuck in this average. And that's why primary data is important. And by the way, the legislator requires it as well. So this is not just something done out of passion or anything, but European legislation requires that while you may use estimated data here and there temporarily, you should collect primary data from the suppliers.
So, to summarize again, primary data comes directly from the source. That means they are directly from the supplier, from the manufacturer of the product, while secondary data obviously comes from other sources. That means these are more like averages, these are more like tables where one says, well, this or that manufacturing method will probably produce about this amount of emissions, right?
Yes, totally. Or imagine a logistics fleet. There are very good estimates of how much a truck needs on average and over what distance. All of that can be estimated. But it could be that the logistics fleet told its drivers that we are doing training for low emission driving, but that will of course never be reflected in the estimate. They might consume 10% less diesel because of that. However, that only reaches the customer if it can be passed on as primary data. And there you see the cycle. It incentivizes doing something like that. If I can really pass it on effectively to my customer, and he considers it in his purchasing decision, but for that, he has to work with primary data.
Now, there is of course a problem with the primary data. I have to ask the original manufacturer each time, so I have to exchange a lot of company data. And I believe that is what your product is intended for, Stefan.
Totally, yes. But that is also what Andreas's product is intended for, because the pleasant thing about purchasing is that it has always been a complicated problem. So it's not just suddenly difficult to talk to 1,000 or 100,000 suppliers because of sustainability, but it was already difficult before due to various compliance guidelines or new purchasing conditions or simply obtaining offers and so on. That's why there has been software and procurement portals and all that for a long time. All of that is already there and actually provides a good basis to say, hey, you have already solved this problem of being systematically and controlled in contact with the suppliers. Let's find a way to smartly integrate the sustainability dimensions instead of developing a separate system where we say we will create our own communication channel.
Okay, understood. But that means, essentially, the ESG data exchange network from Uberge allows companies to publish the data there once, and then, if I understand correctly, it can be retrieved by the companies that need it. This means I don't have to constantly talk to many companies about data, but I can handle it through a tool like Supplier, which can directly retrieve the data from a pool like the ESG Data Exchange Network.
Exactly. And we have, of course, thought a lot about how to do this as intelligently as possible to avoid any inquiries. That's why we always store the data with a so-called allocation method. That means the manufacturer doesn't say something like, I had 1,000 tons of emissions, but rather per kilogram of cement of this type. This is always stored alongside, and thus Andreas can, for example, request that 100 bags of cement of this type have been requested in procurement, and then we can automatically perform the share calculation via an API request. And as a result, the data is much more intelligently usable than if one had to look it up in some table and then say, yes, okay, they have 1,000 kilograms of CO2 excluded, but for what? How much do I buy of it? How much do I need to attribute to myself? All of this is automated on our platform.
Okay. Andreas, it sounds like you should now implement the API directly to really enable the companies that want to move forward. Is that on your agenda? And will it happen?
Yes, of course we will do that. And it simply makes total sense to bring these two things together. So I believe that the combination of good ESG data on one side and a real possibility to use things automatically on the other side is the need and key, because everything else will not work. Without both elements, it simply cannot happen. And that means everything else would not be reasonable for procurement and will not find acceptance. This means, in principle, for companies simply that it must seamlessly transition into the standard, into daily operations, without me saying that I need 3 additional people for that. It will simply not find acceptance and will not be applied on a large scale. From my perspective, this is really a nice combination of two things that are absolutely key products to enable truly sustainable and, in the best sense, CO2 neutral or CO2 reduced procurement. And yes, I think it's great that we can achieve this in combination.
And we have convinced the first computer user live, which is great.
Yes. I think we have summarized that nicely and brought it to the point. Thank you for that. Perhaps you both want to give a bit of a forecast as a closing remark on how this will continue. Or perhaps also gladly, what are the next technological steps in your product that you expect to give it a push? Would you like to start, Andreas?
Yes, of course. So we are gradually moving more towards, let's say, where I can meaningfully use AI to lead to relief in many areas, increasingly improved, and of course to say towards this target image that we have created something that essentially establishes digital procurement for exactly this state, which can also easily and automatically incorporate sustainability aspects, thereby effectively addressing the entire topic. There is, of course, always something that can be done to further develop it in this direction in order to grow with customers who, on the one hand, of course, the topic do from the heart, but on the other hand, also simply want to comply with the regulations. Considering the fact that we just had elections in the USA, where the pendulum has swung in a certain direction, we will of course see where all things develop from here. But, simply put, I would say, I believe it should not be up to us, that if one wants to be sustainable, one can be sustainable, without having to break a sweat for it, so to speak. And I believe that is the crucial point, where one says it works, it can also be done, without it becoming totally difficult and complicated. And that, of course, also represents a collaboration with you.
Great. Thank you for that. And I believe we shouldn't look too much at the USA, but perhaps actually say that it can in the future also work without the USA. And we should simply move forward. Perhaps we should also say a bit more of this now more than ever. And Europe can gain an advantage by not being deterred by it. Our sustainability is an important topic and we are committed to it, creating advantages for ourselves. Stefan, what do you think about that?
Absolutely the same. And we are technology entrepreneurs here. We must, of course, make it as easy and natural as possible. That it is simply completely normal and absurd not to do it because it is just technically elegantly solved and great and helps to purchase better products, and that's it. That is our task in this. One can also endure a backlash or so because you simply integrate it as if it were the most normal thing in the world. And it must become that way, that we operate sustainably.
Those were two nice closing words. I thank you all for that. I thank our technical team in the background. I thank our listeners and look forward to the next BirchTalk. Here are the contact details for anyone interested who wants to connect directly to this exciting topic of sustainability. In purchasing, thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.